You guys can't hear me talking, can you?
Now we can.
Now you can. Okay. I got muted and I had to mute myself for the phone call and I couldn't unmute. Are we ready to go? Yes. Okay. Well, good morning to everyone in the audience who has chosen to share their Friday mornings with us to talk about project selection criteria. I'm Sam Schuckett. I'm the executive officer of the State Coastal Conservancy. Just so you all know, I'm going to be hopping off at about 10:30 to get ready for my next meeting. So I wanted to make some introductory remarks, kind of explain what we're about, and then I'm going to turn it over to Julian Nesbitt and Mary Small, who have been laboring long and hard on this update. So next slide. So we, as probably most of you know, or probably all of you know, have project selection criteria. These are adopted by the Coastal Conservancy Board, our 7-member board. They've been updated from time to time throughout our history. These are high-level concepts that apply to everything that we fund. And they serve both to communicate to applicants and project partners what sorts of things we want to do. We use them to evaluate grant applications when we get them, and they also are a way for the Conservancy Board to understand why we're bringing the projects to them that we bring when we meet. And if you're familiar with our work, you know that we write these staff recommendations, and in every staff recommendation, we go through and say, this is how this project meets our current project selection criteria. Next slide. So why are we updating our project criteria? It's not because we are without anything else to do. You know, times change, things change. Last year, we adopted Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion guidelines. And you can find a copy of the policy that we adopted on our website. One of the things that the policy called on us to do is to update our project selection criteria to help bring our work into greater consonance with the values that we expressed in our JEDI guidelines. So, and of course, climate change policy for the state of California is constantly changing. It changes at least as fast as the climate, if not faster. So that's the other reason that we wanted to do an update at this time. And then, as is true for any bureaucracy over time, if you make changes to policies, inconsistencies creep in, and every now and again you have to do some housekeeping. So there's also some housekeeping that we want to do. The purpose of this webinar is to explain to the relatively small number of you who seem to be interested in this. I think we have maybe 15 or 16 civilians out of 19 people attending. So we're going to basically run through what we're doing, and then we'd like your input and your questions. This is one step along the way of a process. Our board has talked about these things once already, and we'll discuss them again at a public meeting, and then hopefully we'll adopt whatever we come up with by way of revisions at our September meeting. So with that, I have earned my pay for the day, and I will turn this over to Mary and Julian.
All right, thank you, Sam. So my name's Julian, and I'm the AmeriCorps Fellow with the SCC right now, and this has been one of my main projects with Mary to help update this criteria. And so I'm just going to run through what those updates mainly are. And so first things first, we are trying to split the criteria into two different categories: eligibility criteria and selection criteria. And so with eligibility criteria, as you can see, it's where every single project that comes to us is required to meet the criterion under this category. And so some of the Conservancy's past criteria have been moved to eligibility criteria because we just know the projects must meet them no matter what. And yeah, so for example, one of them is the project consistent with the funding source? So that definitely is something that should be required no matter what. So it's in the eligibility category. And then the second one is the selection criteria. And so this is where they're not all required, a different criterion, but they're used to prioritize projects. So basically, if you meet more criteria under that category, then you're actually more likely to get your project prioritized by us for that funding. And of course, there are multiple pathways to meet these criteria, so you be as creative with it as you want. Next slide. And so yeah, here are the eligibility criteria in full. As you can see, there's consistent with purposes of the funding source, there's consistency with enabling legislation, compliance with CEQA, grantee capacity, so you have the ability to administer the funds or find someone as a sponsor who can do that for you. Site ownership / control, so you have the legal right to carry out the project on that land where you're trying to make the project happen. And then long-term management, so you have a plan for the long-term management and care and monitoring of the project even after it's been complete. And then right there is the proposed selection criteria. And so we have number one, the extent to which the project helps the Conservancy accomplish the objectives in the strategic plan. Number two, the project is a good investment of state resources. So is the project feasible? Is the budget reasonable, etc.? Then number three is the one that's especially related to the climate change criteria that Sam mentioned, and that's project benefits will be sustainable or resilient over the project lifespan. So basically, it's been brought in to ensure that the project benefits are sustainable or resilient and apply the appropriate current projections on climate change issues like sea level rise. And then number four, we have the project delivers multiple benefits and significant positive impact. And the Conservancy has always done a good job of highlighting projects that have multiple benefits for communities and the nature around them. And so with this specific criterion, we're describing both those natural resource and community benefits. And if you look in the document that's posted online, we have a lot of concrete examples of how projects could benefit communities especially. So improving public health to creating jobs and so on and so forth. And then the last two, number 5 and 6, are the ones especially related to our new JEDI guidelines. So the project was or will be planned with meaningful community engagement and broad community support, and programs and projects implement tribal engagement wherever possible. And so with both of those, we recognize that not every project that comes to us is going to have the same level of community engagement or tribal engagement just based on the nature of the project. And so we do recognize that, and we do take that into consideration when considering which projects to fund. But with tribal engagement especially, every single project that comes to us is going to be on land that was previously tribal land. So tribal engagement should be made. There should be an effort to make that happen based on the fact that all these projects are on previous tribal lands, and just that effort and seeing where you can go with that, whether it's just helping with cultural resources or using signage or things like that, just showing that effort is where we really want that tribal engagement to happen. And that's the proposed selection criteria.
Okay, so this is Mary Small, the Deputy Executive Officer of the Conservancy, and I was going to go over a couple of questions that we've already been getting, and then the rest of this time is really for the folks on the webinar to provide us with comments or ask questions. And you can do that by typing into the chat box in the, well, my computer is on the right-hand side. So I'll go over questions we've already gotten, and then hopefully we will get some questions from you. So one question that we've gotten from a number of people is CEQA compliance is now an eligibility criteria. Does this mean that the Conservancy will no longer fund planning or fund preparation of CEQA documents? And the answer to that is that yes, we will fund planning. Those projects are typically exempt from CEQA. This is really not a change. We are trying to clarify the Conservancy Board always makes CEQA findings when it funds a project. So CEQA always has to be complete before we can have a project authorized. So there's no real change. It was an attempt to be clear. A second question is, what if the selection criteria don't really apply to my project? For example, if you're doing a really remote fish passage project where you're replacing a culvert with a bridge on private land, there may not be an opportunity for, meaningful community engagement. And we understand that. We recognize that not all of the selection criteria will apply equally to all projects. But as Julian explained, these are sort of the broad principles, broad statements of what makes a project a priority for the Conservancy. And in the document that we provided, there are a lot of examples listed below each criteria of different pathways or mechanisms that a project could use to meet the criteria. And we've gotten a number of comments of what about a different example? And, as long as there are many, many ways that the projects can meet the criteria, we've tried to make them fairly broad criteria. And so the examples listed in our draft document are not exhaustive, and we certainly welcome other examples. We're just trying to convey the broad principles. And those are the common questions we've gotten, and I can now turn it over to you. And again, if you have any questions, if you can type them in the chat box, then, oops, I can't click onto it without advancing the slides. And I'm not seeing any, but I'm going to give it a few minutes. Struggling with PowerPoint. To see if anyone has any comments or questions they want to share with us. And if anyone else is seeing them and I'm missing them, let me know. Everyone is eager to have their Friday mornings. Well, I will just say that as Julian mentioned, the criteria they're posted on our website. There is a anonymous Google Doc kind of form if you want to give us anonymous comments. There's also an email address where you can email any comments that you have, and we would love to hear from folks. As Sam mentioned, the criteria will come back to the Conservancy Board for discussion and then ultimately for adoption before we start using them. Sam and Julian, are you seeing any questions?
I am seeing questions.
Okay.
And the first one is from Patricia Cleary, and can you define legal site control in greater detail?
I'll take that one. We kind of intentionally left it unspecific. So I think there's many ways in which a project, an applicant could demonstrate that they have authority to do a project on the land that it's proposed for. Obviously, if you own the land, if you have a legal right like an easement, but also if there's just an agreement with the owner, it's really just making sure that there is the authority to implement the project on the land where it is proposed. So it's sort of intentionally vague.
But I think it's fair to say that if you don't own the land and you don't have an easement and you're not leasing the land or renting the land, then you probably need a written access agreement
Yeah.
from the landowner. And thank you, Patty, for that, trying to stump the chump here.
All right. And then the next question is from Jeffrey Rhodes, and it's, are projects whose primary purpose ensure and watershed resilience planning for the OLU in the SFA adaptation atlas a good fit for the grant?
Could you just read that? I think I can answer that, but could you just read that again? I want to make sure I got the whole.
Are the projects whose primary purpose is shore and watershed resilience planning for the an OLU in this SFA adaptation atlas a good fit for the grant?
So generally, yes, that sort of project would fall under the purview of the San Francisco Bay Area Conservancy program, which means that we would have to have San Francisco Bay Area Conservancy program funding. For instance, money in a bond that is for the San Francisco Bay Area Conservancy program. But the general answer is yes, and my answer, I hope, gives an example of how the interplay of all of these, criteria work.
Jennifer, are there other questions? I can't see them.
There are no other questions right now.
Okay.
How come
I know.
the only person who can see the questions?
I think that's one of the tricks of
She's the
being
organizer.
an organizer, which I'm learning now.
Okay.
Technology. We're getting there.
Yeah. Here we go.
You know. Okay. But I don't see any more. So with that, I think we will say thank you. And if folks do have questions or comments, we really do want to hear from people. So please email them or use the online form. And thank you for spending your Friday morning with us.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion and Julian and Jen.
Jen, can you end this?
I will end it.
Thank you.
Thanks.